Thanks for coming. I've got 50 minutes left. That's good. So yeah, thanks for coming. What I'm going to talk about today is something which I think is possibly the most important thing that we do in software, and it's also possibly one of the things that we think about the least. So that's why this talk exists. My name's Andrew HARMEL-LAW. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a tech principal at ThoughtWorks. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I've got the really memorable handle, which is AL94781, which at the time seemed like a good idea, but it was my login at my first ever company that I joined, so I thought it was quite cool. But it's really hard to find. But I'm also on loads of other social networks. So if people do want to follow me or ask me questions or whatever, then I'm the only Andrew HARMEL-LAW, I think, in the world, thanks to my wife, because Harmel is her name and Law is my name. So we joined them together to annoy our children, and I'm therefore quite easy to track down. So yeah, what I want to do is talk about how we decide. So like I said, when we write software, we're doing decisions all the time. We're deciding all the time. You could argue, I'm going to argue, that decisions are what make up our software. So we're either making small decisions on our own when we're writing code, we're picking, how we're going to write the line of code, how we craft the commit message, etc., etc. We also make decisions in groups with lots of us all together, sitting there for days and days and hours trying to figure out how we decide about something. We make decisions consciously, we make decisions unconsciously, lots of things, lots of famous things happen, probably not because failures happen, not because someone decided to do something stupid, but they weren't thinking about the consequences of what they were doing because they didn't even realize it was a decision, right? They just did the thing they thought they were supposed to do. So decisions are part of what we do in our day-to-day life all the time. More importantly than that, and the reason I care is because I'm writing a book, which you'll get the link to at the end, for O'Reilly about software architecture. And one of the things I realized when I was trying to write the book was that the architectures are basically the sum total of all the decisions that we make on our own and together in groups, in small groups, big groups, consciously and unconsciously. And because we're building systems that evolve all the time, these decisions sit on top of one another all the time, right? They keep piling up on top of each other. And so therefore you would think that we would be pretty good at being aware of what we do when we decide. And I think we're pretty terrible about it. So this talk is going to fix that and make everything better. The reason why it's a talk as not just a chapter in the book is because one of the big things that I see, because I'm a consultant, that I see breaking companies all the time, especially as we're all moving towards more autonomous teams and teams that are supposed to be self-managing and self-maintaining and teams that build and run their own stuff. The way we do decision-making hasn't scaled, it hasn't kept up. So that's why this talk exists. So I'm going to start with a stupidly naive model of deciding. This is not how, well, it kind of is, right? But it's a bit naive because there's a lot hidden in the box in the middle. So this applies to all decisions. This applies to me standing at Starbucks trying to figure out what drink I want. So it's got 3 stages. The first stage is I realize that I'm thirsty and I probably like a drink and I quite like Starbucks. So I haven't decided anything, but I'm going to go and order a drink. The middle bit, the box in the middle, the deciding, that's where I need to then tackle, even on my own, just for this fact that I'm trying to order a drink, all of the plethora of screens and little signs and conversations that I could have to figure out what I exactly want so that they can write it on the cup and then pass it to the person who can then do the last bit, which is decision implementation. So then what I've hopefully decided for and has been communicated to the barista making my drink, that then happens. So lots of the work happens in deciding. So I've made that smaller on purpose. I've lost my mouse. Where's my mouse gone? Here. But we don't want something this naive. I think sometimes we forget even that this is happening when we make decisions. But what I want to do is make it more accurate. So again, still thinking about all types of decision. How do we make it more accurate? Well, the deciding bit breaks into separate bits. And you don't have to kind of be a cognitive scientist to figure this out. You can feel it happening in your head. It might not be this distinct as you're trying to make or take a decision, but these bits happen. So the first step in actual deciding is option making. You're basically doing all of the work to figure out what you are then going to have a list of to choose between, right? You're thinking, what are the different types of drink I could get if you're having your coffee? And kind of you're also hopefully adding to that list things like, maybe I don't want a coffee, or if you're from Aberdeen like me, these coffees are really expensive. I could probably make a coffee myself for a lot less money and have, a lot of money to spare at the end. But you could also, if you're some of the people I've worked with, some of my friends, they might be like, oh, I can also order off the menu. I could ask for stuff which isn't even on the menu, right? So you're doing the work of making the possible list. This is the step in software where everyone thinks all the hard, exciting architect work happens, right? This is where you're thinking about all of your patterns. You're thinking about all of your vast wealth of experience because the thing you did with Corba in 1997 becomes relevant and all of these things, right? So all of that stuff starts paying off. But that's not the only hard work. There's other hard work which people don't think about when we're trying to make bigger decisions. Things like figuring out how all of this that we're deciding about might fit with all of the stuff we've already got, right? That's quite a big thing. Figuring out what's been tried in the past, what might have failed in the past, figuring out who all the stakeholders are, figuring out what the needs of those stakeholders are, figuring out which bits are in conflict between stakeholder B and stakeholder C, or maybe they're complementary, which bits are constraints, which bits sounds like constraints but aren't really, it's just because someone said it very definitely in a meeting and maybe it's something that you don't care about so much. And also considering the option of what if we just do nothing? What if we just leave it alone and just kind of hope that this works, which is a way to approach decision making. After you've done all that work of option making, you then get to decision taking. Decision taking technically can be really fast, right? Like, I can take a decision. Alternatively, you can see this blend back into option making, and it can take months or even years and paralyze entire companies for trying to do this stuff, or indeed entire human beings, right? Decision taking is technically easier. I pick option A. But there's a big deal involved with it, right? Because by taking option A, I'm saying we're not going to do option B, C, and D. So I've got to select something and do, ignore all the other ones. And then the third part, last thing about decision taking. That's hard for anything. By picking a coffee, unless I decide to buy 2 coffees and then drink half of each, it's probably a bad idea. It even, do I really want a latte, or is a flat white going to cut what I'm looking for? That's hard, right? But if I make an architectural decision, there's never a right answer. There's never a best answer. There's never the obvious answer. If there is, it's probably because you haven't really thought about all of the possibilities. So decision taking in software is what's termed a wicked problem. It's flipping hard, and someone's going to get upset about it. So last step is, if you're not the person implementing it, you need to share it. So if I'm in a coffee shop, I need to tell the person taking my order, and they need to tell the person who's going to make the coffee what happens. So they've got to share it. Again, it's this bit. I've seen companies do the option making and decision making incredibly well, and then they completely fumble the bit where they communicate to the teams who are going to write the code, because they've got this architect and developer separation. They've got the best architecture ever that's on the wiki, and if you look at the code, it bears no resemblance whatsoever to the architecture because they completely fumbled explaining it to the developers. So that's the last one. So before we end this kind of generic view of deciding, there's something I want you to think about, because then I want you to bear that in mind as we look at all of the different approaches to doing deciding. What I want you to think about is, where does the power lie in these processes? So the majority of the power lies with the decision taking, because like I said, by taking a decision, you say yes to one thing and you say no to others. So you're literally saying these things can't happen. This future can't happen. This future will happen. So that's a big deal, right? But there's also a lot of power in option making. And I think we don't appreciate this, and we don't give it the weight that it needs to be given. And I think we don't give it as much weight for various reasons. I think when we realize that it's a really flipping difficult problem and there are no out-the-box solutions, we can't phone up AWS and say, can we have 7 of your somethings, please? We need to do something hard. We need to solve problems, maybe even come up with patterns or combinations of patterns or whatever that have never been put together before, right? That's hard. That's option making. That's like where loads of power comes from, because you're literally crafting new solutions to stuff. There's a slightly less powerful version of that, which is like, we still need to enumerate the 7 or 8 different options. That takes a lot of kind of knowledge and insight and weighing up all the things that I said before. The one which has the least power is where we don't even realize it's a decision, and we just think that there's only one option and we just go straight through and we build it. We haven't even thought about the option of not doing something, which is always an option. Probably a bad one, but And so it's my experience, like I said, that everyone puts loads of emphasis on the decision taking, but they don't put enough on the option making state. So what I'm going to talk about now is there's different ways of doing this, because all of those things happen even if I'm ordering a coffee, right? If it's a small decision, it doesn't have a big impact or whatever. When we start trying to make decisions which are big decisions, which have a wide impact in software, we therefore need to like start marshalling some approach to getting all of this power from all the right people in all the right ways and all the right times and all at the right speed and all that kind of stuff, right? So there are traditional ways to make decisions in larger groups. I'm going to talk about 6 of them. There's a 7th, which I'm not going to talk about, which is the avoidant approach, which means if we ignore the fact there's a decision, if we're lucky, someone will take the decision for us or we'll go bust before it happens, or whatever, so it doesn't happen. There's an 8th one, which is what I talk about a lot in the book, which we will talk about at the end. But what I want to do first, these are the standard ones that everybody knows about, hopefully. So I'll explain what they are and explain how they work a bit. As we go through this, I already mentioned I want you to think about one thing. What I want you to think about, firstly, is where does the power lie? Who has the kind of the power? Who has the control? Who has the ability to affect the future? The other thing I want you to think about is how fast can this happen? How quickly can this process get a decision, right? Because in software, the right decision is good, but the right decision which takes us 3 years is probably irrelevant, right? We've probably gone out of business because somebody's overtaken us 2.5 years ago. Other quick note, very quickly, just check the time. Oh, we're good. Quick note, there are other approaches. So things which are not in my book, but they're in other books. There's a book that I'm proofreading at the moment for someone. There's an approach called deep democracy, which is not the democratic approach. There's things that you'll hear about, like in the world of politics. So you'll hear lots of talk these days about, I've written it down so I'll forget it, citizens' assemblies. You could do a similar kind of thing like citizens' assemblies where you assemble an expert group and get them to weigh up the options, etc. We're not going to cover them, but there are other ways of doing it. So this isn't exhaustive, but it's illustrative. So let's talk first about the centralized processes. So there's 3 of them: autocratic, delegation, and consultative. So the first one is autocratic. It's a centralized approach. So in this approach, there's one person, the autocrat, who does all of the option making, all of the decision taking, and all of the sharing. Then some group, developers, right, come along and try and figure out what the person suggested that they should do. This fact, the fact that there's only one person involved in all of this is key, right? The fact that there's an autocrat doing this option making, decision taking, and sharing is key, right? Everyone else's job is not to take decisions. Your job is to stay out of the way of decisions and just do what you're told, right? An example of this might be a startup has got to the point where they need to hire a chief architect, which happens to some startups. That chief architect decides that because they don't like AWS and they do have a friend who works for Azure, that they're going to arbitrarily change everything from AWS to Azure, right? Autocratic decision, option making, 2 options, do nothing, stay where we are, do something different, go to Azure, right? Upsides, that can be a very fast decision. If it's just me deciding that I'm going to do that and I just tell everyone to do it, right? So that's a good thing. It can also, as you probably guess, be fraught with risk, right? Even if it was the right decision, it could have been the right decision. Maybe this person is very smart and they know something that everyone else doesn't know, that something's going to happen with AWS, like they're going to 10x their prices tomorrow and therefore they should start waiting. No, blah, blah. There might be a reason to do it, but you don't know. But there are still risks. One of the biggest risks is, apart from the fact that it's only one person doing all of this thinking hard and then coming up with the options and deciding, the sharing is reliant on that one person too. If that person is really bad at sharing, I see this a lot, they can come up with the best decision in the world. If the devs don't go, oh, you mean everything, we are literally exiting and turning off our AWS account, then it won't even get properly done, right? And so that can cause problems, but also, when you think about moving at scale, this is fast for individual decisions, but it's slow for multiple decisions. If every single team, and they're a scale up, right? So they're adding more teams all the time, they're probably hiring half of this audience as soon as they can. Every decision has to go through the autocrat, right? So at some point, the autocrat is going to have a massive backlog of decisions behind them. So they're a bottleneck. So what typically happens in those circumstances is the autocrat goes, this is insane. I can't make all these decisions. I will delegate some of the decisions to other people. So that's where we get to the next centralized approach, which is delegation. So it's a variant on autocratic, because the autocrat is the person who's delegating. They're choosing who to select. And then that person does the option making, decision taking, and sharing of that decision if it's necessary. So an example of this one might be the architect, in a moment of clarity, realizes that maybe the last time they looked at the catalog of various AWS cloud services, that was 15 minutes ago, so they're possibly out of date. So therefore, they'll get the person whose job it is, the cloud architect, to come along, and they can tell you, because they did check the Amazon website 14 minutes ago, so they're more up to date with what services are available. So they're going to make the decision. The decision sharing might even be better too, because they might be closer to the team, or they might, if it's a scale up, they might be the chief cloud architect, plus also the entire infrastructure team, because they haven't yet hired any extra people. So it's a little bit slower, but it could potentially give you better decisions, right? Because hopefully you've got someone who's, at least, key thing actually, everyone talks about the best decision. The best decision is based on the information you have available to you with the people and skills you have available at the time. You can always make a better decision by hiring someone smarter. But when I talk about best decision, I kind of mean like within the organization, within the people that are available to you to talk to, right? You could always hire someone later on and get that expertise, but let's pretend you can't, right? So all of these things are marginally improved. It's still a bottleneck because it still has to go through the autocrat to figure out who to delegate to. It's a little bit slower because they then need to pass all the context of what they're thinking and what their strategy is down to the delegate, etc., etc. So, but it's not bad, right? But it's still pretty fast because there's very few people. But there's those problems that I mentioned. So how do you get past those problems? The way to get past those problems is to kind of go the next step to the consultative approach, right? So here, the decision taker is still the autocrat, or maybe the autocrat delegates to a delegate and the delegate does this process, right? But there's one person who is taking the decision, or option making and decision taking and sharing. But now they're like, I definitely don't know enough about this, so I'm going to go and speak to a bunch of people who can tell me what they think. For example, the chief architect acknowledges in a moment of humility that they did just join this organization 15 minutes ago, so maybe they don't know everything about all of the cloud services that are currently implemented and how the cost of them and how they're deployed, etc., etc. So maybe they think, maybe I should speak to some people who can tell me what it's like. So they speak to some of the folks in infrastructure, some of the QAs, and some of the leads of some of the teams, right? So they get this information from those people. Key things about the consultative process, they can ignore everything they say. If these people tell them stuff they don't want to hear, which you may see more often than you would hope, then they can ignore them because they're the people who make and take the decision. So they just go, screw you. I know it sounds hard, but just type faster, right? Which I've never heard anyone say that. But so that's it. So again, so it's marginally slower because obviously you're now seeking information. But if you want to short circuit it because these development leads are just telling you stuff you don't want to hear, you could be like, okay, I'm just going to stop asking them. So the decision could be better, could be marginally slower. Key thing is the person that's the autocrat or the delegate of the autocrat who's thinking about who to speak to, it's still them that's deciding who to speak to, right? If they don't even know that there's someone else that just got hired yesterday that used to work for AWS and knows all about what's going on and really should be consulted, they don't even know they exist, so therefore they might not even consult those people, right? So that's consultative. So let's quickly summarize those before we move to the decentralized one. Centralized approaches are, 2 bullet points. One, power is focused on a single named individual who might distribute it a little bit, but it comes from one person. And they're potentially, therefore, very fast. Like, I mean, it's I'll be honest, I'm not a massive fan of this, but you can, and I have been with scale-ups and startups where the people who are this person are really freaking good, and the reason they're alive in a startup and have reached the point where they can afford to pay ThoughtWorks to come in and help them is because that person made a lot of good decisions really fast, and then everyone just agreed and they just did it. So it's not bad, but you've got to watch it. The key thing is power can't move. So typically when we come in, I need to kind of speak to this person, get to know them, acknowledge the fact that they are the smartest person in the room, but also acknowledge the fact that they now don't scale what used to be a good thing is now a massive queue of decisions from all of these new development teams that they've hired, waiting for this person to catch up. So what you get is fundamentally speed is achieved at the expense of decentralization of control, which sometimes is good. To be very clear, sometimes it's good. It's not always bad. So let's now flip it and go to the decentralized stuff. And again, I'll look at each of them in turn. So the next step into centralized, which is the kind of the next step, the smallest step towards decentralization in this list of 6, is consent model. So the option maker and decision taker are still the same individual person, or maybe someone they delegated to. But once the decision is taken, there's this new line, right? And so a bunch of people who are there to veto or approve that decision now have power. They can say yes or no. So sometimes it's called paramount objection. Like, you definitely can't do this, it'll be crazy. This veto means that the decision that's taken then gets stopped. It doesn't go any further, right? So therefore, some power is then moved. Not the power to take the decision, not the power to create the options, but they can say no to it, so they can block anything they don't like. And one person can block it. 30 people can think it's a great idea. One person can think it's a bad idea. In this kind of pure version of it, stopped. Then the autocrat, who says, do you agree, goes back to the drawing board, or takes the person for a drink and tries to convince them that something's going to happen, right? So this is starting to move empowerment outside of this big circle, right? For example, the option maker is again the architect, but now they're deciding that they have a strong opinion about what language all the new microservices will be written in. And the last language they coded in was Java 8, which worked pretty well for them. So despite the fact that it went end of life about 10 years ago, they can't understand why anyone wouldn't want to use it, so that's what they're going to use, right? But then they ask anyone, and everyone goes, seriously, why? What, like, Java is literally, the version number of Java has got 2 digits now, not 1, so we should at least go into 2 digits, and maybe even like Java 21 or something, because Java 8 is definitely not where it's at anymore. So there's a power shift, but it's not a complete one, because you could then just get blocked forever, right? Having this big battle. Okay, maybe we'll do Java 9. No, still not good enough. Maybe we'll do Java 10, right? So all of these things will still go. It can completely grind things to a halt. I've seen this grind companies to a halt over and over again, but nobody realizes why it's grinding to a halt because nobody said we're using a consent-based process. They're just like not happy about it and they're refusing to like write the code. Upsides are sharing is easier. So ideally, hopefully, the person who's saying, I want you to approve this, they're giving enough information to the people who are approving it, who hopefully are the people who are going to implement it, at least the leads of those teams or something. They understand it. So therefore, if they've had this big debate for months and months, probably, they at least know what the scope of the decision is, so they can go off and do it. So the sharing is easier. Next step beyond this is something which moves these extra people further up the process. So, and it's called democratic. Quick note, it is what you think about when you think about democracy, but it's Athenian direct democracy. So the voting here is like us all going to the Houses of Parliament or the local council, and we vote for things, right? What we have in typical political elections is representative democracy, where we vote for a representative, and the representative goes and votes. So what we're talking about here is direct democracy. The people who get to vote are the people who vote on the proposals for the decisions. So single individual still makes all the options, but then they present those options, nicely crafted, pros and cons, etc., to the team, right? And then the selected people vote. The one that gets the majority votes is the one that passes. So again, chief architect might say, okay, we want Java 8 or COBOL or Lisp or Rust, some newfangled language which nobody's heard of, but people keep talking about. Then that gets voted on. The chief architect, if they're feeling nice, might even say, we're not even going to just ask the leads of the teams. All developers can vote, because maybe they think that more of them like Java 8, so they can try and swing the vote, which would obviously never happen in the real world, like trying to enfranchise or disenfranchise people. But that's what the chief architect might do to try and get the decision. So now the fact that a single person is upset about it can't block, right? So we've removed that. But there are still downsides to this. There's downsides that the majority win. if the majority is 51%, which we know to our great cost in Britain, there's a very slim majority. The whole thing lurches to a very different direction, irrespective of what, a lot of the other people thought. I'm not going to say anymore. But so that gives a lot of power to people who are just in the right side, right? And it completely disenfranchises, which you may have heard in the British media for a lot of years, it disenfranchises a lot of people who might have very valid concerns about Rust, right? For example, until recently, Rust didn't have UI libraries, so the UI team are like, do I have to write my own UI? That's insane. I'm not going to do that. How am I going to work that? So that's not necessarily good. This is where direct democracy comes in. I mentioned direct democracy is democracy, but it recognizes this. So it's like, right, how can we bring in the concerns of the people who are excluded? How can we bring that in and re-vote and stuff? Also, it can lead to kind of begrudging implementations. If I'm one of the 48%, I might, not write the best, whatever it is, Lisp code that I'm capable of writing because I thought Rust would be better. Right, so that's not the best way to kind of lead this change. But decision sharing, however, which I've not put on the slide, but I just need to put back in. Oh, well, you don't really need it because the people who've voted on it. Last thing, consensus. So consensus is taking that kind of viewpoint and moving it even further into the kind of let's all get together and figure this all out for ourselves, right? So this is, for many, the furthest step down the decentralization path, right? So centralized power is pretty much, almost, I'll explain why, not completely, but decentralized power is pretty much moving to everybody, right? And it solves many of the problems, but not all in the democratic approach, right? So the consensus-based approach decisions involve everyone, right? So you might see RFCs, lots of open source projects work like this, not all, but lots, right? So everyone's involved in option making and in decision taking. Everyone's views and viewpoints are weighed up and taken into account, etc., etc. So here, for example, the chief architect might involve all the developers of all new services, and they might sit in a massive room for 6 months and figure out which of the latest languages that they could possibly use would be the best ones, and they have this gigantic debate for a long time. So power benefits wise, it really levels it out, right? The chief architect is now no longer the person who can just say, I said, so just go and do it, right? Downsides, as you can possibly tell from my tone of voice, this I've also seen crush companies over and over again because everyone wants the perfect decision to come out of this, which is never going to happen because just like in politics, it's going to be a compromise. If a few people won't compromise, you can't get consensus, so you can't get consent, so you can't move, and it can stay here forever. Which might be good. Some open source communities work really well like this. Some companies work really well like this. People will self-exclude if they're like, I know I've got an opinion about Rust, but I'm not even going to write any of this code, so I'm going to self-exclude. But there's a lot of this stuff that needs to go involved, right? Additionally, another problem is it can give the illusion of involvement. So the illusion of involvement can be, you end up having the same loud voices, men, talking, probably quite old, maybe grey hair, saying what they think, and they're assuming because everyone else is in the room, everybody's viewpoints have been taken into consideration, right? If they really wanted to have an opinion, they would have told us and we would have changed what we were deciding. They didn't put their hand up and say, does anyone disagree? So therefore, everyone's agreed. And not how human beings work, right? So again, you can kind of get this begrudging thing because people are like, oh, I had a fight last time with the chief architect and it's not going to change anything this time, so I'll just go with Java 8 because I seem very convinced about it. So that's that one. So decentralized approaches to deciding are, quick summary. Power spreads wider and wider as we go down this list. The power, as we saw with the 2 crowns, gets wider and wider spread out. Again, I need to figure out why these don't draw one at a time. Increasingly larger groups are needed to block decisions. But like I said, social dynamics suddenly come way into this, which may turn out to be a large number of the page count of my book, because social dynamics, as we all know these days, right? Socio-technical systems are not just the code. There's all of the stuff around about it. This can get really complicated. And the thing is, decisions can take longer and longer. So sometimes, and this kind of hopefully what I haven't said yet, but I want to pull out a little bit. Some decisions should be quick and smart, right? Other ones are big and company threatening, right? Big deal. Sometimes you do want to spend a long time thinking really hard and then involve everyone. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you just want to do stuff, right? So Oh, last thing. So what we're happening here is with the decentralized ones, decentralization of control has been achieved at the expense of speed. So we're not super fast, right? We're not just like the autocrat chief architect who goes, do it. It's guaranteed to be slower than that. So that's all the methods. Like I say, there's more of them, but they're the kind of the ones that are illustrative. And remember I asked you to think about two questions. Questions were, where does the power lie in these decision processes? And number two, which is the speed? So I've been banging on about both of them, so you probably can guess what I think. So what I want to do now is give you something else to think about. One of the things which we assume, because it just seems to be how the world works, is we assume that there needs to be one person who's accountable or a few people who are accountable, right? And that either they have all the authority or they explicitly share out the authority, like through delegation, right? So for example, if we're doing a vote, there's still someone who's deciding we're going to have a vote, right? It's not everyone deciding we're going to have a vote. Everyone has a vote, but someone else does the deciding. So think about that a little bit too, because that assumption kind of sticks in our head and stops us thinking about other things. So with that in mind, let's go to like the real world where we want this stuff to happen, right? So as I said, the real world these days is an increasingly decentralized, increasingly autonomous, self-managing team topologies. Matt Skelton and Manuel Pais are probably making a fortune. Well, actually, they've just announced that they're going to be a non-profit, so they're not making a fortune. They're going to put it back into the business. But everyone is trying to come up with these product-focused, value stream-aligned, independent, self-managing, fully, upskilled teams that can go and build stuff without blocking each other, right? So this is a picture here. You've got a bunch of teams, probably more than 2 developers. They have a decision. They're building evolutionary systems, right? Stuff's changing all the time. They're learning stuff from production. The product manager's done 3 experiments and discovered that they need to pivot completely from the Android app to the iOS app because of events. So they're all trying to make decisions. Irrespective of the process, either the centralized or the decentralized approaches, there are 2 traditional ways we use in software to organize how this decision power gets divvied out. The first one is this, ivory tower. So a decision is required, probably the team figure it out, maybe the architect figures it out, but probably it comes from a team these days. They then need to go to the architect to get the options made, decision taken, and then maybe shared back out. They can choose to do that either autocratically or delegate it or through consensus or whatever, but it's going there to get the process started, right? The team can't do it well. If you say it quietly, teams don't do this all the time. This is where unconscious decisions come from, because they're like, oh, I just did it, right? That happens a lot. That happens a lot, which is possibly something the world telling us that it doesn't work. But that's how it's officially supposed to happen. Alternatively, because everyone's like, man, the ivory tower sucks. Like the seats are too comfortable and I get altitude sickness because I'm really high up in the ivory tower. To be fair, I've been in the ivory tower and it's terrifying because everyone's asking you to make decisions and you're so far removed from the context of what their actual day-to-day reality is. I'd rather not make their decision, so I'll be like, right, let's consult and let's do all of these things. Or you do this, right? You become the hands-on, in the trenches, coding architect, right? Which I've been a lot. And then you're in there with the teams, right? So you might be doing designs with them. You might be like literally pairing, if you're lucky, writing some code with people to get the stuff going. But you are still the person with the authority and the responsibility, the accountability for the decisions. If it goes wrong, it's not the team, it's you, the architect. So you're still stressed. You're just stressed in a different way, and you probably don't have to wear a tie, and you don't have a permanent desk because you're constantly moving between teams, right? So with that in mind, let's plot the 6 different things that we talked about before on an arbitrary graph. This isn't scientific. I've made this up. You can tell because I used Excalidraw with its like slightly wavy lines and handwritten stuff. So this is definitely not scientific. This is just me based on what I think. But anyway, so there's the 2 axes, decision rights on the y-axis, maximally decentralized at the top, maximally centralized at the bottom, and response speeds, like how fast decisions can be made from the point where we realize we need a decision till we get one, on the bottom. Key point number 1. I've plotted the best place these could be, like the most optimally, like in an ideal world, if someone's really flipping good at making autocratic decisions, I don't care about the quality, but if I'm really good at going, do it, that's where that dot is, right? Same thing for consensus. So for example, I've got some notes here, I'm not sure. Yes, exactly, sorry. So consensus is maximally decentralized because everybody's involved, but it's slow because everybody's involved, right? Autocratic is fast because it's just me and I'm telling you what to do, but it's super centralized because it's me and I'm telling you what to do. Something else to think about, there's two areas of this graph where there's absolutely nothing. The bottom left, the centralized and slow approach, which very few people would argue would be a good place to be, is a thing. You could have approaches which are centralized and slow. The way to have a centralized and slow approach is if an autocrat is terrible at making decisions. Then they can drift way back into centralized and slow, and that's like the worst of all worlds. But also, keep thinking, is there something trailing the book? There's a link at the end. You can click to read the early access version. But it would be really cool if there was something in the top right? But we're not going to get there yet. So, so let's think about what makes a process fast to respond. Autocratic, one person, super quick. Delegation, two people, super quick, slightly slower. Consultative, slightly less slow, but we can make it fast if we need to, right? We get everyone in a big room because we're the chief architect and we tell people what to do and they do what we tell them, right? If we go to consent, this can still be fast. So again, this is the best one. The way that consent is fast is, and you see this again in open source projects, where the chief architect is looking for consent because what they're looking for is people to go no. So like Guido van Rossum was famous for this in Python. He was very much the guy telling everyone where Python was going to go. But he was very good as well about building the culture so that there was the way of Python and there is the way we write Python. This is Pythonic. This is not Pythonic. So the collective had a pretty good idea of what it was. Guido was still the person largely who said, not always, but largely, right, or he'd delegate. But so there was, people could still block it. There would be long discussions on mailing lists and stuff. But because Guido was pretty much on top of things, things largely moved at a relatively fast pace for such a large project and something that's important as Python, right? And there's a key factor across all of these, which I've kind of already talked about, but just to be very explicit. The key factor in response speed is the number of people who can participate. Specifically, the number of people who can participate in the decision taking or vetoing and option making. That's the kind of thing, right? The more, just getting human beings together takes longer. If you don't have to, then it's fast. So what makes something decentralized? So if we start at the other end, decentralized, a consensus, everyone in consensus is potentially involved, right? The only way you can remove that is if people choose explicitly not to vote, right? Or not to have not even not to vote, but not to participate. Next along is consent and democratic. So therefore, there's still the same number of people involved, but they're involved less at the early option-making stages. They're involved more at the later stages. The reason I've plotted them kind of in the same level for decision rights, you can do things and be involved in different ways, but it kind of evens out as a level of decentralization. Whereas consent is a lot faster than democratic because democratic can it takes longer to vote, right? And finally, if we think about the consultative one, the number of people involved in the decision is minimal. It could be one person, right? But we can then involve other people. So if we want to, we could use a consultative approach. I could ask everyone, I could send an email and say, everyone, what do you think if I said we should go to Java 8? And I'd probably get a pretty fast response. That's a terrible idea. But I could, right? I could consult everybody. So that's decentralization. But there's one thing that I haven't talked about, and that's what I want to quickly mention now. All of these have assumed that the person initiating the decision or the person who's responsible and accountable for the decision is fixed. And that's doesn't have to be true, right? Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote a really interesting book about Google and the rise of the attention economy and all of these kind of things, she talks about two things. She talks about who decides, in Google, he was you decide, I choose to use Gmail, right? But she's like, who decides who decides? And her point in the book is like, by engineering for people's attention, they're taking lots of the agency away from me, even though I still think I've got the agency. So her key point is like, if I can decide who decides, like me, I think I should decide. I'm not the autocrat, so it spreads it out a lot more. So that's not plotted on any of these because they're all kind of preordained. Who is the person, right? It's the architect or architects who are doing it. But across all of them, what's the key factor that makes it more decentralized? The key factor is regards to who has the decision right, who is involved, how many people are involved. And if you want to really push it, how many people can initiate it, but haven't seen that yet, right? So more involvement, more decentralization. So given that, if we wanted to put something in the top right, what would we be looking for to go into the top right? So the things you would look for is, number one, you'd want to involve the appropriate people, so not nobody, not everybody, the right people for the right decision, right? But still trying to keep that number as small as possible, right? You don't want to involve everyone because you're not sure. Number two, what you want to do is maximize the entitlement to initiate those decisions. If I really want these decisions to pop up all the place, right, and not rely on me starting these decisions because I'm the architect, you want to have an approach which can allow decisions to kind of pop up wherever they're needed. Thirdly, because that sounds like a really scary thing, you need an approach that will maximize trust, because otherwise decisions are happening all over the place, which is kind of what happens anyway, like I said, but now we're acknowledging this fact that people are making decisions because they don't like architects. And fourthly, it should minimize the need for sharing. So minimize as in, if something needs to be conveyed to everyone, it's conveyed to everyone. But if I've made a decision in my team which doesn't impact anyone, I've done something which doesn't change, if I've added a build step to my build which has no impact on anyone else, cool. No one else needs to know, right? And this is the thing. So what we're going to do, hopefully, or here, is think about who has authority and who's accountable. Because if you move that, if you kind of break that apart a little bit in your head, suddenly this eighth option appears. But people get worried, right? They're like, but enterprise architects tell us that we must have this person, and all of the organization tells us that we must have this one person, this one arse to kick, as we used to say in Scotland. Like one person who is named and responsible, right? But what's interesting is if you look at some of the gods of enterprise architecture, the people who kind of ultimately tell us all what we can do. Open Group is one of them, and they've got the open architecture framework. They've got a flavor of that called the Open Agile Architecture Framework. And it says, as long as you align decision-making authority with accountability, if I decide to take a decision and then I take it, it's me, right? Even if I'm a lead of a team. So they're cool with this, and they're like, this maps to all of the regulations and SOX and everything, and you need to make sure that you document your decisions with ADRs, which there's been other talks about, etc., etc. But it doesn't need to be one person whose name's on the door, right? It doesn't need to be. It says, if you click there, you can see it. Which I was amazed at, because I didn't think like something like TOGAF. It's not TOGAF, but it's TOGAF aligned. We'd approve for this, but it does. So that then means we can have decisions which are the right fit. For example, if I'm in a team at the top and I require a decision, it might be possible to just have that decision and I can make it and take the decision and I just do it all on my own. Or if I need, I can bring in an architect or I bring in some stakeholders. A bigger decision might be between me and another team. I'm going to change an API and your team's depends on the API. Then we get together, right? The two teams get together. Maybe we need an architect. We bring them in, but we don't if we don't. Or there's big decisions which affect everybody. All of these levels of decisions happen, right? At different times, at different cadences, etc., etc. They would come from an architect, because the architect's job, which is a good job, is to look at the overall system, right? That's where the word systems architect comes from. It's like making sure that the right things are decoupled in the right ways, that the teams are independent in the right ways, that the teams are not independent in the right ways too, right? There's a bunch of, like if every team is writing their own Gradle build file, and having all of the problems of setting up their own Gradle build file, when one team can do it once in consultation with all the other teams to write the perfect Gradle build file, which it fits into all of your infrastructure, do that, right? But then you can come to that conclusion as a group. Right? So there's one way that you can do it. So this is the big reveal. There's a dot that fits in the top right. It's called the advice process. There's one rule. This is the rule, which always scares people a lot. The whole process fits on a slide. Anyone can make any decision. If you say that, right, these people are now accountable and responsible. So if someone wanted to audit you and say, who decided to swap from Azure to AWS, They'd find the ADR with your name on it, and then you would be accountable and responsible. But you can do this, right? The open architecture framework says you can, as long as it's documented. But that could be risky, right? So what you need to do is 2 things while you're option making and before you decision take. Number 1, you should seek advice from all affected parties. This is like consultation. So it's not permission, right? It's not go ahead. It's not clearance. It's advice. You need to seek their advice, listen to them, and see what they think, right? You can still ignore them because you still have the power to make the decision. But this is when, again, entire chapters of my book come in, because social pressures and trust and socio-technical architectures come in, etc., etc. You can set this up and you can cultivate a culture, or discover or uncover the culture, which is already probably half happening in your teams anyway, and give it an explicit way of happening, right? So all affected parties, typically in affected parties, if I make this decision, other teams have to put a task on their backlog. That's how you think about affected parties. Or people with expertise, right? So maybe there's someone who used to write Ant build files in the past who is not going to be affected by your decision to move to Gradle at all, but you know that they wrestled with those Ant build files. For people who maybe don't remember Ant build files, Ant was before Maven. It's like some people I still quite like Ant. Ant was before Maven, and then Maven came before Gradle. Ant didn't have like the directory structure that Maven has, if you're interested in that. But speak to the person, right? If they wrestled with this, even if they wrestled with it 30 years ago, which maybe when I started writing code, even if they wrestled with it a long time ago, they know what's hard about this, right? They'll be like, don't trip out. I know, can Gradle do this? Because Ant couldn't, and it was a nightmare, etc., etc. You find people who know, right? Because why would you not? You want to find out who wants. If you get that, and you have the advanced process, then you can do this. So, what does the advice process look like? It looks like this. You have this advice process zone. So decisions all have to go through this advice process zone. And that's where anyone can initiate a decision going through this. An architect can do it for across the teams or just with an individual team. Individual teams can do it. Teams can group together and do it. You end up setting up kind of collaboration forums and all these kind of things. And there's interesting, there's a lot of books. My book covers this, but other books are coming along at the moment as well from other people to talk about, right, okay, so we're going to do architecture more officially more as a group. How are we going to do it, et cetera, et cetera. So you do it like this. The key thing is, and I am not, to be very clear, I am not advocating that you go back and start doing the advice process, because you'll probably want someone who's currently the person who has authority and accountability to approve this, but you can do like a shadow play version of it where you do it and then say to the architect, we've already made this decision for you following the advice process, please could you ratify it? And if you do that enough times, they realize that you're actually serious and you're doing it properly. But whatever approach you take, any of these approaches, all of these 8, the key thing is you need to have the right people involved in the right decisions, in the right place at the right time with the right skills. That's what I want everyone to take away from this. Also, hopefully cool if you read my book. But the key thing is we don't think about this at all. So however you do it, I don't even care if it's an autocracy or if it's consultative for absolutely everything. If you want to change the color of a button, everyone needs to have an opinion. I care less about that than I care about the fact that you're not thinking about it. So what I really want people to do is think about it. Oh, there's a thing. So, meanwhile, Shana, and I can't, sorry, what's your? Zarina, they've like gone and started a thing. Because, as I said before, there's way too many white, male, grey architects in the world. But there are a lot of people, as I've hopefully made clear, there are tons of people who want to make and take architectural decisions, and they should, right? The reason the book does exist that I'm writing, which I keep talking about, get a prize at the end, is what happens when people make decisions is kind of opaque and weird, and it happens in rooms you don't get access to. The book is like, right, let's open the doors of the rooms and see what happens, and teach everybody to make the right level of architectural decisions at the right time. That's the book. And there's a community, Architect Her. Go and join the community. Thank you very much. That is the talk. If you want to read the book, there's a free QR code for the bottom, so you can go to O'Reilly and get a free month, unless you already had a free month, in which case you need to use a new email address, unfortunately. It began as a blog on Martin Fowler's website. If you want to read the free version, go to the blog, etc., etc. Please give it a shot. And give me feedback, because I'd love to hear. This is not the only way to do it, so people have used different flavors of this all the time. So I've got less than a minute left, so I've dodged all the questions.